What we are seeing is the rise of anti-Israel Republicans, and we have been seeing this in the changing demography of the Republican Party. There has been a very scary shift in the political, spiritual, ideological atmosphere of the world, and it does not spell anything good for Israel. We are shifting from a zeitgeist that was pro-Israel and being Zionistic to one that is hostile towards Israel, or at least indifferent towards Israel. You will eventually see politicians using as a selling point that they are not getting paid by AIPAC. And when you see that sort of thing, understand that it will spell the end of America being pro-Israel. If you look at history, what do you see in the history of the Jewish people? Pogroms, massacres, and you eventually see the Holocaust. So because this is so common in Jewish history, what can we expect for the future? What we can expect for the future is another Holocaust. All right, everyone. So there has been a lot of talk lately about tension between Donald Trump and Netanyahu. There was a guy by the name of Michael Waltz who was serving as Donald Trump's national security advisor. Michael Waltz is your typical pro-Israel, neoconservative Zionist, and he wanted the United States to go to war against Iran. He wanted the United States to join forces with the Israelis and to do a coordinated attack on Iran. Donald Trump is against this because Donald Trump is supposed to be the anti-war guy, and plus the great majority of the American populace is against war, is not interested in war because America is still suffering with PTSD from Iraq. So what does Michael Waltz do? He goes behind Donald Trump's back, having discussions with Netanyahu about a coordinated attack on Iran. This pisses off Donald Trump. Donald Trump fires Michael Waltz. Israel had a lot of hope in Michael Waltz. They believed that they could use Michael Waltz to convince the Trump administration to agree to a coordinated attack on Iran, but Donald Trump cut those hopes away by firing Michael Waltz. So there is something to be said about all of this talk about tension between Donald Trump and Netanyahu. The Israelis do not like the fact that Donald Trump told the Saudis that the Saudis don't need to have normalization with Israel to have a nuclear deal with the United States. And so this is to the trepidation of the Israelis, because the Israelis don't like this sudden little shift that we have been seeing in American political discourse when it comes to foreign policy and Israel. When it comes to Israel. And this has really been to the ire and to the rage of the pro-Israel media figureheads. Ben Shapiro, Laura Loomer, Mark Levine, they're all pissed off at Donald Trump. And this really does spell the end of the pro-Israel media empire. How do I know this? Well, because Donald Trump is extremely popular. The guy won the popular vote. So if you go against Donald Trump, you're not really going to be gaining any popularity. Now, you will receive the favor of the neocons, you will receive the acceptance of the neocons and the pro-war crowd, but as far as the general American population goes, you are going to lose popularity. Now, how do I know this? Let's go back down memory lane a little bit. What happened to Glenn Beck? Glenn Beck used to be the biggest figurehead in the American conservative movement. What happened? No one talks about Glenn Beck anymore. No one cares about Glenn Beck. Why? Because Glenn Beck went against Donald Trump. Glenn Beck was so popular. The guy was so filled with hubris. The popularity got to his head to the point that he was talking about building a literal city. The guy was on the verge of building another Jonestown, but at the level of a city. It was pretty creepy. But what happened to Glenn Beck? He lost his popularity. He attacked Donald Trump. And so the Republicans, the conservatives, saw this and they said, you're going against our hero Donald Trump. To hell with you, Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck lost his popularity overnight. So Ben Shapiro going against Donald Trump really does spell the end of the Shapiro media empire. Another thing also to keep in mind is that the pro-Israel sentiment in the United States has been declining a lot. It's been declining by the year. And so as Israel loses popularity, so will Ben Shapiro, and we have already been seeing this. So what we are seeing is this giant vibe shift. We have been seeing a shift in the zeitgeist from one that was very pro-Israel to one that is becoming more and more hostile towards Israel, or at least more and more indifferent towards Israel. Americans have PTSD from Iraq. They are not interested in war, rightfully so. Life is too damn short to be getting into wars. And so what? What do you want to do? You want to deploy troops to Tehran, where American troops are going to be open to being shot and killed by Iranian Revolutionary Guardsmen, Hezbollah fighters, Shiite militiamen. And really, you just want to force a bunch of soldiers to be put into another meat grinder. It's absolute insanity. But these Ben Shapiro types, Ben Shapiro, his ilk, they don't give a damn, because in their minds, well, they're just goyim anyway, so who gives a shit? It's all about supporting Israel, anything for the cause of Israel. You want to spill human blood for Israel? That's A-okay. So it's basically there is a cult of Israel, and sending soldiers off to war for Israel is considered great because it's for Israel. It's a cult. It's human sacrifice at this point. So the great majority of Americans don't want war. Trump knows this, and so he doesn't want to be a neocon. He doesn't want to be a pro-war guy. So he sees Mike Waltz going behind his back, talking with Netanyahu about what? Starting a war with Iran. He gets rid of Mike Waltz. So like I said, there is something to be said about all this talk about tension between Trump and Netanyahu. Now, does this mean that Donald Trump is going to abandon Israel? No. Does this mean that Donald Trump is just going to absolutely reject Israel? No. But what this does mean is that there is really a shift in the sentiment towards Israel, and this is being reflected in American politics. What happens in the general population, the zeitgeist of the general population, is going to be reflected in the political world. This is why I always say you can't fight the vibes. I always say this, you cannot fight the vibes. People try to fight the vibes, but they will not win. The train has already been set. Listen, when you see Kanye West doing a song called Heil Hitler, and millions of people are listening to this song, and hell, even freaking Spotify has been having difficulty removing this song from its website, you know there is something changing in the ideological, political, and spiritual atmosphere of the world. Not just the United States, but of the world. So what do the vibes tell us? What are the vibes trying to tell us? What is the zeitgeist looking like? We are shifting from a zeitgeist that was pro-Israel and being Zionistic to one that is hostile towards Israel, or at least indifferent towards Israel. And we are seeing these vibes, we are seeing the zeitgeist manifest itself in various ways. One is these politicians in the American Congress that are really not so much in favor of the pro-Zionist narrative. We saw this recently with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rand Paul going against the anti-Semitism bill that the pro-Israel lobby was trying to get passed in Congress. You had Republicans going against it. So that is a political manifestation of what has been happening in the metapolitical realm. There's the political realm and there is the meta-political realm. The political realm is what? The activities of politicians, Congress, the president, etc., etc. The political realm is going to reflect the meta-political realm. The meta-political realm is what? The vibes, what is being said in the media, but really, really what is being said on the streets. What are people saying? And you know how most people feel by simply going to the website that most people are going to get their news. I'm talking about X/Twitter. And when you go on to X/Twitter, you don't see a whole lot of pro-Israel folks. You see a lot of hatred against Israel, and you see a lot of sympathy towards Hitler. And things are really getting scary. I don't like what I see. I just want to make that clear. I do not like what I am seeing. And you have people who are heiling Hitler and they're listening to Kanye West. Hitler was a mass murderer. The guy murdered millions of people. He was trying to exterminate the Jews. And so to praise this guy really does reflect a growing, and animosity is not even the word, a growing violent hatred against Israel. And I've been saying this for years. Hitler is going to make a comeback. I've been saying this since 2016. And every year, it just becomes clearer and clearer that I have been correct. because I have doubted myself. When I first started saying these things back in 2016, no one really believed me. Hell, I didn't believe me. I didn't. I was thinking like, Ted, I would tell myself, Ted, you're talking some crazy stuff here. I mean, is this really true? And I would second guess myself. I would doubt myself. And I would say, Ted, maybe you're going a little bit too far. Ted, maybe you're becoming a little bit too far-fetched. Maybe you're being a little bit too sensational. But every year, it gets weirder and weirder and weirder. When Donald Trump was doing his inauguration event, we saw Elon Musk doing the Hitler salute. And before that, we were seeing Elon Musk bashing the ADL, saying, well, you know, the ADL, which is a big major Jewish organization in the United States, he was saying, oh, the ADL hates white people, it's anti-white. That sort of propaganda has been used for years to stoke up hatred against Jews amongst white people. And you see the richest man in the world mimicking neo-Nazi type propaganda. And then you see the richest man in the world doing the Nazi salute. And then you see Kanye West saying Heil Hitler in a song, and that song not being rejected by the majority of people, but being embraced by millions upon millions of listeners. When you see this sort of thing, you have to admit there has been a very scary shift in the political, spiritual, ideological atmosphere of the world. And it does not spell anything good for Israel. And this is why I keep telling people, Israel will be abandoned. Israel will be abandoned. And this has been Israel's greatest fear, understandably so, because if Israel is abandoned by the West, Israel is done for. Israel's biggest allies are who? The United States and the European Union. Those are Israel's two biggest allies. If Israel is abandoned by the West, Israel is done. This is why Israel losing its popularity in the United States is Israel's biggest concern. And in the midst of all this, to make matters even worse for Israel, in the midst of all this, we see Turkey being right next door to Israel now, because Turkey has been parking its troops. Well, Turkish troops have been in Syria for years, but Turkey has really just taken over Syria for the most part. And Syria is right next to Israel. So now you have the second most armed country in NATO, Turkey, being smack right next to Israel in Syria, and Turkey hates Israel. This is why Netanyahu was rushing over to the United States to talk to Donald Trump about mediating between Israel and Turkey, because Israel is terrified of Turkey. And they know that they cannot be in a war against Turkey alone. But at the same time, the United States is not interested in a war in the Middle East. The United States is not interested in deploying a massive numbers of troops into the Middle East. And so it spells something very, very foreboding for Israel. How is Israel going to actually guarantee its protection if it cannot rely on the United States? And so what does this bespeak? What it bespeaks is Israel eventually being abandoned. Because as the anti-Israel sentiment grows, eventually we are going to be seeing more and more policies, or we are going to be seeing more and more of this shift that is indifferent towards Israel in American political discourse. Tucker Carlson is very critical of Israel. Candace Owens is very critical of Israel. These two people are not unpopular. They are extremely popular. So if the pro-Israel sentiment is popular, why are these two people very popular? Why is Norman Finkelstein popular? And why is Ben Shapiro declining in popularity? Because the pro-Israel sentiment in the United States is declining. And eventually this is going to be reflected in actual real policy. So this spells something very, very ugly for Israel. And now you have people heiling Hitler in a song. There eventually is going to be another Hitler. And I'm afraid there's going to be another Holocaust. I don't want this to happen. I really actually feel sorry for Israel, because most Israelis are oblivious to this reality. Most Israelis are oblivious to the reality that another Hitler is going to come. Trump repeatedly bypasses Netanyahu, stoking dismay among Israelis. And it says here, reports emerged that Trump was considering offering Saudi Arabia access to civil nuclear technology without demanding that the kingdom, the Saudi kingdom, normalize relations with Israel, a precondition that had been set by President Joe Biden. So here are all these Israelis, right? They were very critical of Joe Biden. They were saying, oh, Joe Biden is restricting Israel. Joe Biden is hindering Israel's war against Hamas. And now we see Donald Trump, the guy that the Israelis were glorifying, the guy who, after he won, Israel was celebrating in jubilation, saying, oh my God, look, Donald Trump won. This is amazing. He's going to do great things for Israel, etc. And now you see Donald Trump telling the Saudis that they don't need to even have normalization with Israel to have a civil nuclear technology deal with the United States. Now, the pro-Israel narrative has been what? Arabs bad, Israelis good. Arabs bad, Jewish Israelis good. Arabs cannot be trusted. Israel is the only country in the Middle East that you can actually trust. This has been the narrative. And so because of this narrative, people have thought you can't have any sort of serious dealings with the Arabs unless you can get them to actually agree to normalization with the Israelis. This has been the pro-Israel narrative because Arabs can't be trusted according to this viewpoint. But now you see Donald Trump not only making deals with the Qataris and the Saudis and the UAE, but you see Donald Trump telling the Saudis that they don't even need to have normalization with Israel. Again, this is a slight shift. It's not a major shift, but this is a slight shift in the political discourse in regards to Israel. And so it says here on Sunday, senior Hamas leader Khalil al-Hayya said the group would release Israeli-American hostage Eden Alexander following direct talks with U.S. officials. So the Americans have been pushing for a ceasefire, and they told Hamas, release the Israeli-American hostage. And this was done by Hamas as a good gesture to Donald Trump, with the hopes that Donald Trump can push the Israelis to agree to a ceasefire. And what I read was that Steve Witkoff is still pushing the Israelis to actually commit to a ceasefire. Is that really going to happen? I think there will be another ceasefire, but it's not going to be honored, and the same thing's just going to repeat itself. That's my prediction, because this is what always happens in the Middle East. Not the Middle East as a whole, but this is what happens all the time in this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But still, you're seeing the Americans pushing the Israelis to do a ceasefire, and this is to the ire of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is not interested in peace with the Palestinians. In fact, this is what Donald Trump himself said. He said this back in 2021. You can look it up. Donald Trump said Netanyahu is not interested in peace. Now, let's say you're a pro-Israel guy, right? Let's say you're a pro-Israel guy, and I tell you, hey, listen, Netanyahu is not interested in peace. What would you tell me? You would tell me, what are you talking about? Netanyahu is the man who wants peace. The Arabs are the ones who don't want peace. And you would say that I'm repeating anti-Israel propaganda. Okay, fine. But this is coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump. This is not coming out of the mouth of Norman Finkelstein or some Palestinian activist. This is coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump. Donald Trump himself said that Netanyahu is not interested in peace. Secondly, during Trump's first term, Trump said that the settlers are a hindrance to the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Also, after Biden won the election in 2020, in 2021, what happened? Netanyahu, after Biden won the election, congratulated Biden's election victory and said, oh, congratulations, Biden. Donald Trump was so pissed off about this. He did an interview in which he said, I have not spoken to Netanyahu ever since he congratulated Biden. F him. This is what Trump said. He said, F him. F Netanyahu. So it says here that Israeli concerns about Trump's negotiations with Iran and other threats to Israel, quote, are not being taken into account, or if they are, they're dismissed, said Dennis Ross, a former senior State Department official who served as a Middle East envoy under both Democratic and Republican presidents. And remember, there was a meeting between Donald Trump and Netanyahu. It was a press conference, and all these journalists were there, and there were all these media cameras that were there. And Donald Trump, right to Netanyahu's face, said that his administration was going to enter into negotiations with Iran. the complete antithesis to what Israel wants, the complete opposite to what Israel wants. Israel for years has been pushing the United States to go to war against Iran. And Donald Trump just flipped the bird, just gave Netanyahu the finger and said, we're going to have negotiations with Iran. And what did Donald Trump tell the media? He did an interview with Time magazine, and he said, yeah, Netanyahu tried to drag me into a war. He's not going to drag me into a war. This is what Trump said. And he said, I did not make it easy for Netanyahu when I responded to his request to get the United States to agree to a coordinated attack on Iran. He said, I did not make it easy for Netanyahu. So it says here, what you're seeing is that President Trump has an idea of what is in our interest, and that comes first. In other words, it's not Israel first, it's America first. He defines the nature of our interest abroad not through a geopolitical or security context, but an economic, financial, and trade fame. I think President Trump might have the view that we give them $4 billion a year in military assistance. I do plenty to support the Israelis. And what Donald Trump is basically saying is, we give the Israelis billions, and they never gave me a damn plane, but the Qataris gave me a plane. In an interview that aired Thursday, the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, pushed back on the assertion that the administration was overlooking Israeli concerns and told an Israeli television channel that, quote, the United States is not required to get permission from Israel to reach a ceasefire with the Houthis. And that's another thing. Why did Donald Trump say that there was a ceasefire with the Houthis? And Donald Trump said that there was a ceasefire with the Houthis after the Houthis struck the airport in Tel Aviv. So the Houthis hit the airport in Tel Aviv, and then Donald Trump says, yeah, we're going to have a ceasefire with the Houthis. I mean, it could all be smoke and mirrors. It could all just be smoke and mirrors. It could all be hot air. But what I will say is that what I see happening is a slight shift, at least a slight shift in America's political discourse and policy when it comes to Israel. And this is really a consequence, or this is really the result of anti-Israel sentiment increasing in the world, in the Western world. In Israel today, the soaring anxieties mark a sharp reversal from November when many celebrated Trump's election. So a lot of Israelis are now filled with anxiety. Understandably so. Listen, I'm not an anti-Israel guy. I'm not anti-Israel. I, in fact, pity the Israelis. I don't like what they've been doing in Gaza. I don't like the war criminals. I do not like the fanatics in Israel. But as far as the regular Israeli goes, I actually pity the average Israeli because they're oblivious to what's going to happen in the future. If you look at history, what do you see in the history of the Jewish people? You see what? Pogroms, massacres, and you eventually see the Holocaust. So because this is so common in Jewish history, what can we expect for the future? What we can expect for the future is another Holocaust. And I'm not celebrating this. I'm not saying this is going to be a good thing. I'm saying this is going to be a very bad thing because mass murder is always a bad thing. And so what do we see, right? If you look at the history of the Jewish people, you see hatred, pogroms, the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was the apex of all anti-Jewish massacres. It was the biggest one, as we all know. And then what happened? All of a sudden, there was a shift after World War II. Pro-Israel sentiment went up through the roofs. It went up to the heavens. Americans became extremely pro-Israel. Americans used to be very anti-Semitic, by the way. I know this because during the Holocaust, there was a ship, I believe it was called the SS St. Louis, and this ship was filled with Jewish refugees who were trying to escape the Nazi reign of terror. They came to North America, and they were rejected by the Americans because, as the Americans believed, these Americans believed in eugenics, and they believed that if you allowed the Jews to enter the United States, that they would ruin the Anglo-Saxon stock of the American society. And so the ship was sent back, and those people in that ship were sent back to the death camps. They were sent back to their deaths. And the Americans didn't really give a damn. Why? Because anti-Semitism was very common in American society, as it was common in the rest of the Western world. But there was a sudden shift that occurred after World War II. But what do we see? We see that pro-Israel sentiment beginning to dissipate, and we are seeing people returning back to the very common way of seeing the Jews, which is very negative. So there was this slight turn on the road of history. There was this slight turn away from what was commonly seen in the history of the Jews, but now we are seeing people going back on that main road of anti-Semitism, and it's very scary. I don't like what I'm seeing. I really don't. I don't like how this Heil Hitler song is super popular. I think it's very scary, to say the least. So it says here, but the mood began to shift even before Trump's inauguration. Privately, some Netanyahu allies groused about Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, pressuring Netanyahu into a ceasefire agreement with Hamas, and claimed that Witkoff was influenced by personal business ties with Qatar, etc., etc. And you do see the Americans doing business deals with the Qataris, the Saudis, etc. And it says here, in the Oval Office in April, Trump announced in front of Netanyahu and the assembled press that the U.S. would hold direct talks with Iran over its nuclear program. The Israeli prime minister, who has pushed U.S. leaders for more than a decade to use military force to dismantle Iran's nuclear facilities, glanced away, peering visibly surprised. So it says here that one Trump advisor who described Trump's treatment of Netanyahu as one notch above his fractious White House meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky 3 months ago, said influential MAGA voices have worked throughout the spring to resist efforts by, so look at this, influential MAGA voices have worked throughout the spring to resist efforts by pro-Israel lobbying groups and neoconservative Republicans to install Iran hawks and others seen as overly sympathetic to Netanyahu in key national security posts. So you have the MAGAites, the MAGA Republicans, combating the pro-Israel Republicans. This is a clear manifestation of what I've been talking about, the zeitgeist. The anti-Israel sentiment is increasing, and we are seeing this in the fact that you have Republicans going against the pro-Israel lobby and the pro-Israel Republicans. Former National Security Advisor Michael Waltz was removed from his position, I've already talked about this, after he appeared to have engaged in intense coordination with Netanyahu about military options against Iran, which angered Trump, the Washington Post reported this month. In MAGA, we are not Bibi fans, said the Trump advisor, using Netanyahu's nickname. Trump is adamant. He wants people to put the guns down. So you have this Trump advisor telling the Washington Post, we are not Bibi fans. So these are not your stereotypical boomer Christians who believe that they have to support Israel because that's what God wants. That's not what we are dealing with. That is old news. That is an endangered species. That is a dying breed of political discourse. What we are seeing is the rise of anti-Israel Republicans, and we have been seeing this in the changing demography of the Republican Party. Trump got a lot of minorities to vote for him. A lot of Arab Americans voted for Donald Trump. A lot of Hispanics voted for Donald Trump. A lot of African Americans voted for Donald Trump. And these demographics do not give a damn about Israel. They don't give a shit. In fact, enough of them are actually very hostile towards Israel. We see this with Candace Owens, Kanye West, etc., etc. The people who have been the most pro-Israel demographic in the United States have been overwhelmingly white Christian Americans, specifically white Christian boomer Americans. And so if Israel loses the support from white Americans, it will spell the end of Israel. Because which demographic is the majority in the United States? White people. White people are the majority in the American population. And the biggest supporters of Israel have tended to be white Americans. So if Israel loses the support of white America, it will spell the end of Israel, because Israel will be abandoned. This is the biggest fear of the Israelis. So it says here that the rise of an Israel skeptic wing in Washington, particularly within a Republican Party that is traditionally seen as close to Israel, poses a new challenge, Israeli officials and analysts say. For decades, when American presidents from Republican George H.W. Bush to Democrat Barack Obama have clashed with Israel on matters ranging from the West Bank settlement policy to strategy toward Iran, Israel has depended on its supporters in Congress to push back. And yet, even after Netanyahu and some of Israel's supporters threw their weight behind Trump, a number of Republican lawmakers allied with the president, such as Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, and increasingly turning away from Israel, leaving it without recourse in Congress. Oh my God. So guys, for how long have we been hearing about the immensely powerful pro-Israel lobby and how the pro-Israel lobby is so powerful because it's so wealthy? Well, guess what? Wealth cannot defeat the vibes. What have I been saying this whole time, guys? Wealth cannot defeat the vibes. If the vibes are anti-Israel, it doesn't matter how much money the pro-Israel lobby has. They're not going to be able to buy people's support. I'm talking about the American people. Now, why do I say this? I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about the American public. Why is this? Because politicians are dictated by the spirit of the age. They are dictated by public opinion. If it is popular to be pro-Israel in order to get elected, politicians will be pro-Israel. If it becomes unpopular to be pro-Israel, if it becomes a danger to one's political career and political campaign to be pro-Israel, you will see less politicians being pro-Israel. And you will eventually see a politician, a major politician, or a very popular politician, win based on the fact that he is not getting paid by AIPAC. You will see a politician say, I'm not getting paid by AIPAC. And this is going to become extremely common in the United States. You're already seeing signs of this with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rand Paul, who are critical of any sort of laws against anti-Semitism. And so we're seeing the signs of this. You will eventually see politicians using as a selling point that they are not getting paid by AIPAC. And when you see that sort of thing, understand that it will spell the end of America being pro-Israel. And eventually, Israel will be abandoned. Eventually, it's going to be abandoned. And you're seeing the rise of the Arabs, the rise of Qatar, the UAE, the rise of Saudi Arabia. And it reminds me of that prophecy in the book of Genesis. Remember, Esau was exploited. He was exploited by his brother Jacob. Esau was starving. There was a famine. Jacob had a bowl of lentils. And he said, well, if you want these lentils, you have to give me your birthright. I want the land. And Esau gave Jacob the land. And then Jacob lied to his father. He tricked his father because his father was blind. And he said, oh, I'm Esau, Dad. And his father believed him. And his father said, okay, here's the birthright. You have the inheritance to the land. And Esau lost his birthright. And what did Isaac tell Esau? He said, Esau, your people will live in a desert. Well, that's how the Arabs live, right? The Arabs in the Gulf states, they live in deserts. And Isaac told Esau, you will live in a desert, your people will live in a desert, but eventually you will overthrow your brother. And so we are seeing the rise of the Arabs, and eventually we are going to be seeing the fall of Israel. Anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.